Good morning and happy Thursday. Hope you're having a good week. So I want to focus for the next few days on the last line in Hebrews chapter 5, which talks about learning to discern between good and evil. When I wrote Future View 3 or 4 years ago, I talked about monsters under the bed. I opened by saying, look, lots of things are getting better in spite of what people think. Talked about the four big forces of change: globalization, advancing technology, changing moral dynamics, and winnowing of worldviews. And I said those are the things that are going to carry us forward unless one of these monsters under the bed is real. And I said, okay, so we've got a variety of them. I talked about a nuclear bomb going off. I talked about climate change. I talked about electromagnetic pulse. And I talked about a pandemic, actually. Didn't do a very good job of thinking about the economic implications of a pandemic, but I mentioned it. And I said, look, it's hard for us to make sense of all this because it's easier to project problems than it is to figure out when solutions are going to come by. But my biggest concern is the sort of collective set of problems. So there is weather disruption that causes problems along the coast, that leads to some political instability, that leads to global conflict, that leads to nuclear bombs. It leads, it's sort of an unfolding of a bunch of things. And I said, it's hard to know about all this stuff, but I do think we've got to be more discerning and wise and sort of pay attention to this. So I said, I don't want to sound like Chicken Little, but I want to just be alert. And I think there's a passage here that calls this out. So I want to read Hebrews chapter 5, starting with verse 12. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food is for the mature, who, because of practice, have their senses trained to discern between good and evil. I think that this idea, those studying solid food, because of practice, have their senses trained to discern between good and evil. I think there's a sense in which discerning between good and evil is not always all that easy. I will certainly say, as a pastor, it's not always easy to figure out how to respond to a situation. Do I exercise grace or do I exercise law? There's lots of news noise out there where it's hard to know what I should be paying attention to and what's true and what's not. We've got a globe that is so big right now where you're paying attention to everything that's going on everywhere. It can be overwhelming. And all of that aside, it's important to recognize you and I are living in a time where a sense of right and wrong is eroding. And not just what is right and what is wrong, but whether or not anything is right or wrong. And we are defaulting to personal preferences. And some of this is because we're in a culture that is not being handed down, it's more being handed up. As opposed to the older, the wise, the mature sort of reflecting and giving advice down to those that are younger, our culture is being set increasingly by younger and younger people. So all that leads to some challenges, and I think that we just need to be alert to this. So look, there's not just, my big point here is that we're living in a time when culture is in decline. It tends to be what happens to cultures. They tend to start more righteously, and they tend to move in the other direction. Now, this is challenging to talk about because, first of all, the U.S. is not just one culture, it's all kinds of cultures. And secondly, it's not like things were great in the past. Those that long for the good old days are almost certainly white men. And there's a lot of things that are getting better. Right now, big issues around racial justice and lots of ground that we have got to take. but things are better than they were 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So there's improvement happening. So it's not, this is not an easy issue to just say everything is clear cut. But I do think we need to understand that part of the reason to become wise, part of the reason to be a student of the Bible is so that we have more objective standards to the things that are going on around us. One of the purposes of the law, so Reformed theologians will talk about three purposes of the law. One of them is so that we can see our own sin. One of them is to help civil government know how to lead. The third one is that Christ followers, redeemed people, would know how to live life and how to serve and what to be working towards. But we've got to have these objective standards that come not where we get our bearings from our culture, but where we get them from God and the Word of God. So we're going to keep talking about this tomorrow. Have a good day.